I should add that Mr. Chavez did request permission for his absence in that he is attending a funeral. So with that, we are now focusing on the LAO's recommendations for the home-to-school transportation. And so why don't we start with the LAO?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Kenneth Capon with the LAO. As you mentioned, we're here to present our analysis of the state's home-to-school transportation program. And our findings today are summarized in our handout and in your agendas. Before we start, the basic message for you today is that the state's current approach to transportation funding is outdated and irrational. So we'll spend the next few minutes laying out three basic options for the legislature to address those problems going forward. I'll be brief on the background. School districts in California currently transport about 1 in 8 students to school on a daily basis. Many districts are transporting only students in cases where federal law requires it, and that's generally in cases for students with disabilities. A few districts actually transport most of their students, and those districts tend to be smaller, more rural, and students may be living further from school and less able to use alternative modes of transportation. So turning to page 2 of our handout, we go over the key features of the current program. The state currently appropriates $491 million for pupil transportation, and that's an amount that covers about 35% of costs of transportation costs statewide. The amount each district receives is based on the funding the district received in the early 1980s. At that time, all home-to-school funding allocations were frozen in place. Given the changes that have occurred in local service levels since that time, we now have a system where the home-to-school program covers the majority of costs in some districts and almost none of the costs in other districts. The local control funding formula adopted last year kept the same basic approach to transportation. So districts are continuing to receive their historical transportation funding on top of their LCFF allocation with no changes to the allocation formula. So to improve on the state's current approach, we have identified 3 basic options for you to consider. And all 3 of these options, what they share is that they're a way to phase out the use of historical factors to allocate transportation funding. The way that they differ primarily is in how the state will fund transportation going forward, whether that be part of the LCFF or through a separate funding stream that's specific to transportation. So our first option, which turning to page 3 lays out that option. The first option is for the state to fund all transportation costs through the LCFF. And under this approach, there would not be a separate funding stream that's specific for transportation. And so the rationale for this, I think the most compelling rationale is that this is consistent with the way the legislature chose to treat all other types of local costs. As you know, under the old system of school funding, the state had nearly 60 separate funding streams, tried to recognize every local service, every variation in cost. And under the LCFF, the state took a different approach, which is to recognize that districts provide a variety of services, have a variety of costs, and the state's not going to try to get fine-grained and adjust for each of those costs. So even though some districts, we know, have higher costs for teacher salary, some districts pay more for campus safety, some districts may pay more for maintenance, the state's not making those adjustments. So one question I think we'd put out there is, should the state consider adjusting for transportation but not those other costs? I think another point to consider is that under the LCFF, and this is a continuation of the old system, but school funding is linked directly to student attendance. So school districts only get to count pupils for funding purposes for the days they're physically present at school. And so even whether or not the state continues to have a dedicated funding stream for transportation, that approach has a strong incentive for districts to focus on activities like transportation that help students get to school. So kind of looking at what this option would mean, we would suggest a gradual transition. And under this approach, the state would gradually take the funding that's currently being provided separately and outside of the LCFF funding formula and roll that into the LCFF formula. And that approach would mean that over time, the historical home-to-school transportation add-on would gradually phase out. No district would receive less total funding than it currently receives, but once you got the full implementation, there would no longer be the separate add-on. And you could use the funding freed up from that approach for any other purpose, increasing LCFF across the board, special education, and other legislative priorities. So turning to page 4, we lay out a second option, and this option is to fund only transportation costs that are extraordinarily high. And so under this option, the state would pick a threshold, say 8% of a district's budget, and fund most of the costs that exceed that threshold. And so for districts that did not have costs beyond that threshold, this option would be very similar to option 1, where costs would be funded through the LCFF. And I think the reason the state might consider this option is that most districts are spending a few percent of their budget on transportation, but there are a small number of districts that are spending a much higher share of their budget on transportation. And this approach will let the state target a small amount of funding pretty specifically toward those districts, districts that might otherwise need to make disproportionate reductions to instruction or some of their other basic services. We'd estimate the cost of this approach to be in the low tens of millions, so much lower than what the state is currently appropriating for transportation. And again, the funding that would be freed up from this approach should be available for other purposes. So returning to the final page of our handout, the state's third option is to fund a share of all transportation costs. And under this approach, the state would define a set of allowable transportation costs and then reimburse the same share of those costs in each district. We'd suggest under this approach, the state share be set at least 35%. That would bring every district up to the current statewide average. But we'd also suggest that the state share not exceed half of all costs. There's always been a concern, and the state actually rarely funds reimbursement-based programs, and that's partly out of the very reasonable concern that when costs go up under a system like that, some of those costs are directly passed on to the state, and local school districts, which are making the decisions that affect costs, are only bearing a portion of those cost increases. So we think that with a 50% match of at least 50%, you would still have a strong incentive at the local level to keep costs reasonable and focus on transportation when it's truly necessary. The main reasons for doing this approach would be to improve upon what the state currently has, the current program. This would continue the approach of having a broad-based categorical program, but address many of the historical disparities that have arisen, and it would address all variation in cost. So if the state is concerned that you've got even relatively small variations across districts, this approach speaks to all of those variations. For a transition approach, we think this is another area where the state could implement the approach gradually. In many cases, when the state implements a new formula, it includes what we call this hold harmless language, where it guarantees that no district receives less than what it receives under the current formula. And so that would be an option for this approach, where the state could provide every district with the greater of the transportation funding it's currently receiving, or the state share that's selected, the share between 35 and 50%. And so looking at the costs of that, that would increase state costs, that would reduce the funding that's available for other priorities mentioned earlier, like LCFF implementation. Depending on the exact share the state selects, the cost increases are in the range from about $120 million to about $260 million. And that'd be the initial costs, through inflationary pressures and local service increases, you'd have increased costs going forward as well. So we think those, we looked at a variety of options in doing this report, and we think those three options are the ones that have the most merit. The current system, without your action, will continue to become more irrational. The district fundings continue to become more and more disconnected from the factors that justified them in the early 1980s. And so we'd suggest focusing on what you want the system of transportation funding to look like, recognize that it could be a gradual transition, but to set a new course that ultimately phases out these historical funding allocation factors.
Thank you. Next, why don't we turn to Department of Finance?
Sure. Chris Ferguson with the Department of Finance. Relative to the LAO's home-to-school transportation proposal, we think that it's premature to make any adjustments to the LCFF given that the formula is just now being implemented and the transition is just now beginning. So we would recommend no substantive adjustment in those regards.
All right. Department of Education.
Monique Ramos on behalf of Superintendent Torlakson. The department agrees with LAO's premise that the home-to-school transportation is long overdue for reform. The current system is inequitable in ways that districts who didn't participate in the original program are excluded from participating, and those that participate currently receive varying rates. In our view, the LAO has provided three options that are more equitable than the current system. The department believes that all options are feasible, although points out that some of the proposals are more expensive for implementation, both at the state and local level. CDE believes that the cost to restructuring the home-to-school transportation program would open up participation to more districts and improve the rates of participation. Any reimbursement program that is adopted by the legislature should clearly define a uniform criteria for identifying reimbursement costs and controls in any reimbursement-based program suggested. The need for statewide funding cap with proration of any costs exceeding the cap. If the legislature were to adopt a cost-based reimbursement methodology, such as those provided in options 1 and 2, the CDE would encourage the legislature and the LA to direct the LAO to develop a sparsity index to further inform decisions decisions surrounding making the costs. In addition, the CDE believes that the small school districts and County Office of Education bus program replacement program should not be consolidated into the home-to-school transportation program. The LAO's proposal under options 1 and 2 that the transportation-related capital costs be annualized shall be allowable expenditure. CDE is concerned that the school bus purchase and replacement costs would represent a significant proportion of small LEA's home-to-school transportation costs and would potentially be a barrier for any other participation in the home-to-school transportation program. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to start off our discussion by asking the LAO, of the three options, do you have a recommended option?
So in this report, we don't make a specific pronouncement on which of these options is kind of better than the others. We think that once you kind of focus on kind of what the priority is for school funding, then the options fall into place pretty quickly. If you really want the option that's the most consistent with LCFF, that really is similar to what the state did last year, clearly option 1 is the way to go. If you want a broad-based program, if you want to recognize all variation in costs across the board, then option 3 really makes sense. So I think our message is think about kind of what's the most important factor in the school finance system and use that to set your basic course.
Which would be the less? Am I correct in understanding that option 1 would not require any additional state funding because the current funding would be rolled into the LCFF?
That's correct. So under option 1, over time, not immediately, but over time, you'd actually free up funding that could be used for other purposes.
And so, and between options 2 and option 3, option 3 is the more expensive of the alternatives.
That's correct. Under option 2, you would free up most funding as well, because the amount needed to fund extraordinary costs is a small amount of what the state is currently providing. It's really only option 3 where if you want to bring all districts up to a specific share of reimbursement, where the state would need to provide more funding than it currently is.
So option 2 would be consistent with the goal and objective of the LCFF to give more discretion to local decision-making bodies as to how to use those dollars, and yet still hold harmless all school districts by requiring that they receive the same amount of home-to-school transportation funding as they received in 2012-2013.
So in both option 1 and 2, we're suggesting that no district receive less total funding, LCFF plus transportation, than they received in 12-13. Option 2 is really to focus just on the small number of districts that have those very high costs. In all other cases, and for most other districts, as you say, it's very similar to option 1.
And so option 2 also has that it would incentivize local school districts to become more efficient in terms of their transportation programs by the state only paying for a portion of the transportation costs. Is that correct?
So in all of these options, the locals would have a very significant would bear a significant share of the costs. In option 1, they are bearing 100% of the costs. In option 2, most districts would bear 100% of the costs, except for a small number of districts with those very high costs. The state would cover some of those. In option 3, they're bearing at least half of the costs. We think that's an important component of any of these options, and so that's one consideration. I think when we looked at this was making sure that all 3 options would have incentives for efficiency, and we think they all do.
Who would be the winners and losers under option 2?
Well, I think I can just speak to the districts that kind of under the current distribution system, the districts that receive very high levels of transportation funding are those districts that were running large programs and received large amounts of funding in the early 1980s when the program was locked in place. The districts, and those districts, particularly if they've had low enrollment growth, are more likely now to have a higher share of their costs covered. The districts that historically never ran transportation programs, that experienced very high enrollment growth, that have increased their services quite a bit, those are the districts receiving the least from the current program.
So that does not necessarily fall into readily identifiable categories like rural districts, or it's just those that were spending the most in the early 80s?
I think if you step back at the 10,000-foot level, rural districts generally have higher costs and generally are receiving more funding, so higher costs and higher funding. But there's a lot of exceptions to that. There are rural districts that receive very little transportation funding today, and conversely, there are some urban districts that receive quite a bit of funding. Okay. It's really dependent on kind of what the population and what the characteristics of the districts have looked like and how they've changed in the past 35 years.
But with the biggest driver of the current funding picture for home to school being the picture that existed in the early 1980s.
That's correct.
All right. Any other questions from the committee?
So I guess partly a statement as well as a question. I tend to agree with the governor that at this point, given we had a significant debate over all the categorical funds last year. In the two, and we went back and forth, and the two that we sort of decided to sort of put off were the TIG fund and this home to school fund. I think that at this point, given where we're at implementing LCFF, I tend to agree with finance that it is sort of premature to be doing anything about it. I come from a district, San Francisco, that I don't know where we fit in terms of how much money we get, but most of the funding for transportation, as you mentioned, goes toward transporting special needs children. And so it's not really one of those programs that is an option. We couldn't decide to go cut it tomorrow. That money would have to be replaced from some other piece of funding or LCFF or somewhere. So I do agree, in terms of the outline that this program, we need to be looking at it, but I don't know that we should be tinkering with it as we're really unveiling this LCFF. I think, we have an opportunity to take a look at it over the next, few years and to really see how it fits with the LCFF funding. But I know that, for example, in San Francisco, if you were going to tinker with that money would have to come from some other place. It wouldn't be just that we would stop offering transportation for those children. That money would have to be replaced somehow, whether it be a parcel tax or other general fund money or something. So I think that's oftentimes what we're looking at. It's not seen as, and maybe in other districts it is sort of a luxury item, or it's not necessarily a critical item, but at least in the district that I'm familiar with, it's absolutely something that would have to be, the funding would have to be replaced from somewhere else.
So, if I could, I'm not sure if there's more questions, but if I could just make one closing comment. I think we would say when the legislature adopted the LCFF last year, it made great strides in addressing a lot of historical inequities, many irrationalities, many problems in school finance were addressed with this formula, and I think that really reflected the level of engagement by many members of the legislature on the issue. This report was in response to a request from the legislature that we look at the program and make recommendations going forward. And I think that report really speaks to the fact that on transportation, the work of the LCFF was left undone, and recognizing that additional reform would be needed. We think the fact that there were few changes to the allocation included in last year's budget package speaks to the fact that this is a program where the reform is left undone, and it's something where by addressing this program, putting it on a more rational path forward, it can finish some of the work of the LCFF that was left undone.
Just as a comment to your statement, again, there was, I think, a reason why we had left it undone is because it was not quite as simple as I think your report made it seem in terms of untangling funding, districts. I mean, the analysis, I'm sorry, I haven't had a chance to read the report, but the analysis doesn't talk about districts, doesn't talk about going into particular kinds of funding. It was very, very difficult to untangle that pot and the other pot. That's why it was, in essence, sort of left to be tackled later. I don't know that the way that your report characterizes that it's quite as easy as it seems, especially once you get to a local level, when you actually have kids that need to get to school, and that these districts, in part, were sort of leaving districts holding the bag on it. So, again, I sort of applaud the thinking on this, but I do have some serious concerns. I don't think it's nearly as simple as the report makes it out to be.
All right.
If I may,
any
Mr.
further
Chair,
comments?
Rachel
Yeah.
Ehlers with the LAO. Just to clarifying, in case it wasn't clear, this report is in response to a legislative request that was included in the LCFF legislation. To your point, Mr. Ting, that it was it is complicated and was so complicated that we knew we couldn't quite get it right last year and we needed more time. So I think that was why the legislature directed us to dig deeper into it, look at it deeply. We certainly found that it's not easy, which is why we don't have one recommendation in the report, which we typically try to do to help guide you. We found that it was so complicated, that there were such overarching questions that we couldn't even come up with the right answer unless some important legislative questions questions that you all need to grapple with were answered. So just want to be clear that this was our first attempt to help you grapple with those, and we are here as your staff to help continuing, because we do think it's really an important issue to keep moving forward with. So if there's anything else we can do to help grapple with the issue and close off this remaining angle of our developing a more rational school funding system, we'd like to do that.
All right, thank you. We appreciate the LAO's very thorough report, and this is not the end of our discussion. This is just the beginning. Well, a continuation of our discussion from last year, and so today we will not be taking action on this item, but we will be reviewing further your recommendations. Thank you very much. Thank you to the panel.